Welcome back to the task force on the implementation of the pupil weighting factors report. I'm getting better and better at saying it. Today is still Wednesday, November 10th. This is the second part of our meeting after a break. We have looked at a model that took the new weights from the Colby memo into account. And now we are going to hear from Deb Brighton from JFO about some reflections that we might want to think about from the model we just looked at, as well as looking at the cost equity model. That's sort of a second option on the table. Deb. Hi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm Deb Brighton, consultant to the Joint Fiscal Office. And I wanted to start with following up on what we talked about last time, and that is putting the associating dollar values with the weights that you've been looking at this morning. So we, as you know, we redid all the weights, and so we redid the numbers that go along with it too. And if you pull up, I think it's actually the second document under my name on the website, draft cost equity amounts.
Oh.
It's actually the
cost equity amount.
Cost per equitable pupil associated with weights. Is that the?
That's the title of the first table.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
And
draft
all right.
Cost equity.
Right.
Okay. So what that's showing you is by each category, it's showing you the weight that we're using now. And then it's showing you the cost per eligible pupil in that category. So, and there are a bunch of costs. The first one is what I call the global average, which is the cost that if you ran the model and we had just one school district, what the cost would be. And then the others are actually running it through the weighting formula with our districts so that you could see the range. And I think that was a question that came up last time that I wasn't able to answer. So for example, for middle school, the weight is 0.36. And on average, if we were statewide, one district, that would be $3,727 per middle school student. And the average is slightly different when we run it through our districts. And that's just because of the spending per pupil in the districts where there are more or fewer middle school students. But the average was 3,823. The minimum was 2,316, and the maximum was 7,256. And the reason that we have the minimum and maximums is basically because what our process is doing by weighting the students is changing, giving you more or fewer equalized pupils, and the spending per equalized pupils differs in each district. And so a new equalized pupil in one district will draw from the ed fund more money than in other districts.
Deb, I have one sort of clarification, and I guess they're all clarifications. One, just want to sort of highlight that these dollars are on top of what, say, a student who is not living in poverty and is in elementary school, and all of this sort of on top of. I don't know what the word is for that neutral student, but baseline. I'm going to try baseline student. Thank you. These numbers are on top of the cost of a baseline student, not the standalone cost, right?
Right. And okay. In this case, the cost of a baseline student is only $10,000. So in other words, we've made the assumption that we're keeping education spending the same for reasons that Brad explained so that we can compare. And so if we kept education spending the same overall, and then we divvied it up between baseline students and then these additional weights for different reasons, we'd end up having that baseline student cost $10,000 versus the current, which is 16,000. Well, I would say that current law equivalent in 2020, which was 16,000. And I think it's important when we go through this, one of the reasons I'm doing this and sort of the next table is to decide the magnitude of all of the weights. I mean, we can look at the weights sort of individually, but then we have to realize what's left for the baseline student.
And so that $10,000 that you just said, that's not a number that you made up out of policy. That was a number that sort of filtered out of your analysis of what the
Right.
total spending is, right?
That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
I think it's 10,127.
And I just want to remind folks, I think 2 meetings ago, Deb shared a series of graphs that took us through sort of why the weights have a greater impact on the higher spending district.
Yep.
Okay. Back to you. Thanks for the interruption.
Okay. So I think when you look down this, you can see that the biggest per pupil cost is poverty. And since it's 1.03, it's not a surprise that it's slightly higher than the cost of that baseline student. In other words, we're saying a poverty student costs twice as much, roughly twice as much as that baseline student. And then you can see that where the small school grants come in, the sparsity and small school grants come in as being less. And I think that I did this for 2 reasons. One is that it's sort of easier to look at a dollar amount to try to figure out if things are sensible than it is to deal with 0.65 or 0.46 or whatever. But the second is I also wanted to respond to Senator Brock's questions last time about what is the range that we're seeing if we use the weighting formula. And so the second table, which the title is Total State Costs Associated with These Weights. And that is showing you the gross numbers for statewide. So in other words, the weight for middle school is basically directing $69.8 million from the ed fund to districts because of the middle school students. And that's 4.9% of the education spending total. So these weights here end up in the bottom being 38.8% of education spending. And it's over $500 million. And so I guess the question is, when you, in addition to looking at the sort of town by town where they end up, I think there's another question as to whether we've got sort of the right distribution between that baseline student and the different weights.
Understanding this. Yeah.
I just have a question of on that percentage of education spending. Why do that? Like, what does that question make sense? Like, what would we infer from that number, or is it just an informational? Does that make sense, Deb? It's a question for anybody, or you, Deb. That why did you choose to do a percentage of education spending?
I guess because I think it's important to realize maybe it's in the category of unintended consequences, but if we focus only on the weights, we're focusing on sort of the people getting these districts getting these additions, but we're also doing subtractions. We've now subtracted, the baseline student without any weights is now costing only $10,000 per pupil. And so the question really is not just do these weights seem to be fair But I think the other piece is, are the unweighted students, the students that, or the schools that don't get these weights, is there enough left? Is that a fair balance? I don't know how
That
to answer the
difference is
question.
But basically, it's what I hear, what you just said is like, these weights equal 40, almost 40%. And so there's 60%, quote unquote, left over for the baseline students.
Yeah,
And I would add, it's not just the baseline students, it's the baseline of all the students, right? It's not, this is every student counts, gets the baseline and then the weight on top
Yes.
of it. So it's all that's left for all the baseline.
mhm.
All other costs.
And I think this really helps illustrate the difference between sort of applying weights in our wild Vermont tax universe and applying weights elsewhere, where it truly is sort of additive to money going to students or to schools, whereas here it all winds up equalized in the same pot. I think Representative Beck had something before you.
Yeah, I just think of it as, if, capital I, capital F, every student in our state was a baseline student, then we could provide the same education for $553 million less. That's not the case. So we have to build back in 553 to educate all these special cases that we're focused on.
So if I could follow up on that, and Scott can correct me if I'm wrong, if we had a hypothetical elementary school of students who weren't in poverty, weren't ELL, in a non-sparse or rural district, this is assuming it should cost $10,127 per student to educate them.
In that utopia scenario, yes.
But I think it's really important to remember that those spending decisions are made at the local level and that they're all over the map. There is no district that has that sort of baseline amount that is spent on the baseline student. And that this amount of money is not actually what you said, going directly to educating those students. It's going into tax capacity for these districts that then they make local decisions about how to use.
And I think that range, as you said, is, the fact that the $10,000 isn't real is very well illustrated by the first table, where you see these really incredible ranges between minimum and maximum for what the weight means in a district.
That's striking.
I mean, there's $12,000 difference on the impact of the poverty weight.
Yeah. It's amazing.
And that is solely an impact of that. Higher spending districts get more impacted.
Or capacity.
Let's have Deb answer that.
Alligator chart. Deb's alligator chart, basically. Right?
Deb, Senator Perchlik asked if that was solely the impact of the differences in spending decisions at the different districts.
If what is solely that, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Difference between the minimum and the maximum
Oh, on that chart, yes,
on the chart one, table one.
yes, sorry. Yes, that's solely the minimum is the very lowest spending district and the maximum is the very highest. But I should point out also that when we're talking about high spenders and low spenders, in this case, it's after the weights. That sort of shifts the weights shift the spending per pupil. So, okay. Just to make it clear.
Senator Harding, were you raising your hand or stretching?
No, I was raising my hand. Sorry, I need one more go around on these three columns. I'm really sorry. So the first column, average global, that's the cost that is derived from basically calculating the weight. That's the average.
Yes.
So that's directly linked to the weight. And then I'm sorry, in all the conversation, I lost the thread here on those average, minimum, and maximum.
Okay, the global average is if you ran the weights as if we were all one school district. And
Yep.
then the second average number is running it through our school districts. It's slightly different. Okay, and that depends really on, in each case, how the students are distributed. The eligible students in each risk category are distributed in districts with different spending per pupil, but it's close to the statewide average, as you would expect. Then in each category, the minimum is the amount, the cost, or the amount that eligible student would draw from the ed fund in the lowest spending district. And the maximum is the same thing, that kind of eligible student would draw that amount in the highest spending district.
Okay.
Okay,
Can you help me better understand how the spending, how the amount drawn on in a maximum spending district impacts the tax rate of someone in the minimum spending district?
Well, essentially, it's taking more out of the ed fund per pupil. So there's less in the ed fund. So that would mean that would mean that the yield would change, basically, so that the tax rates would go up. If they took a lower amount out, the tax rate would go down.
It negatively affects all districts. Okay.
I just wanted to make a comment about this concept of high spending versus low spending districts. That is, I'm assuming you're making that comparison on a per pupil basis or per equalized pupil basis?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so it is really important to remember that some of the quote unquote high spending districts are high spending because they have few pupils. They don't have very many kids, but they still have the fixed costs of running a school district. And their spending per pupil is higher because they still have to pay all the fixed costs. They don't have the economies of scale that some of the bigger districts have. And that was somewhat mitigated by Act 46 by districts merging into bigger districts and having more pupils and more economies of scale. But there are still districts and individual schools that didn't merge that have higher per pupil costs. So it's not always they're just spending, frivolously or whatever. It's usually not. It's often because of size and other factors.
And again, if people want to go into the Wayback Machine, into previous meetings we've had, Deb also shared some data on our first or second meeting, I think, about how there was very little correlation between high spending districts and what their weight changes might look like, low spending districts and what their weight changes might look like. That it was the distribution of high and low spending districts really didn't line up with people's changing capacity if we applied the new weights, which is, I think, also counterintuitive.
And another counterintuitive piece to that is that the weighting changes the spending per pupil. And so Brad's table showed you what the new spending per pupil would be. But strangely enough, you could have a high spending district with few poverty students, so they're going to lose equalized pupils. So that's going to make their spending per pupil go higher than it was before. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but I just wanted to point out that it's not the same, necessarily the same high spenders as before. It's a new calculation here. So if that's sort of clear, I would move into the using the cost equity version just to show the differences that.
Is that clear enough for folks? Okay, great. Thank you, Deb. Moving
But
on.
I realize you haven't talked about whether it's the right balance or whatever. So I'll leave that conversation for you for later.
Thank you. Yes, I think people need some digestion time.
Yeah, okay. All right, so the next thing that I did was to take these same numbers and run what we were talking about before as a cost equity formula. And we do know that in the weighting study process, they first came out with a cost table so that for each category there would be a cost. And then they turned this cost into weights. But they didn't have the costs for all of the categories that we're using now. And although they said they could, for a new contract, they could figure out the costs. But in order to illustrate the two approaches, we decided to just take the costs that we backed into from the weights that you looked at this morning and use them for comparison. Okay, but so these are not, what we anticipated doing is with using the costs derived by the weighting study, and these are sort of backed into weights to use as an example. And part of the reason that we did those costs was not just to figure out another way to do it, but also to give you that sense of what dollar amount was behind each weight so that people could decide whether it was adequate or not. And also so that you could go out to educators to see whether they felt that in reality it would work in the schools or not. But the cost equity approach that sort of came out of that discussion was that, well, what if we distributed that flat amount to each district based on their number of eligible pupils in that district? So for high school students, you take the high school students in the district and you'd multiply it by the high school cost of $4,038. And then you add to that the middle school students multiplied by the cost of $37.27, and so forth. You add up that total and send that amount from the ed fund directly to the district as their cost equity formula amount. So that would mean that there would not be a maximum or minimum. It would all be, in this case, the global average going out. And so there's another handout that looks like Brad's colors, or same colors as a spreadsheet that's district by district with the same district numbers that Brad used this morning. And it's based on the same weights that I don't think it has a title on it. Do people see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we have it.
Got it? All right.
Yeah, I'm
So-
sorry. I forget that you can't see our faces, Deb. I forget that you can't see our faces. And so
Right.
thanks for checking. Yes.
Okay, so the first column is the ELL grant plus the cost equity payment. This is the money that would be coming from the ed fund to the district directly. And then second column is the remaining education spending. So that means what a district would do would be take their budget as they normally do, subtract federal funds or other revenue, subtract this amount, the ELL grant plus the cost equity payment in column 1. And then that gives them the remaining education spending that they're going to use to calculate a tax rate the way they normally do, which is they take that spending and they divide by their pupils and they come up with the spending per pupil. And then they divide that by the yield, which in this case would be much lower than it had been before because there's less money in the ed fund now. And they'd come out with their tax rate. The next columns I added here, poverty rate was there because it helps you understand how the rate, where the rates are lower or higher than they would be using the weighting method. So the last three columns are the three rates to compare. One is the FY20 weight prior to incentives, and Brad explained where that came from earlier this morning. The next one is the rate that you would get if you did this cost equity formula distribution first. And then the last one is the weighted rate. In other words, that was the weight that you were looking at using the weights that Brad explained this morning. And when you look through those and compare the two weighting methods with each other, and basically the comparison with current law is about the same. For Brad's earlier explanation of the weights and this cost equity version are using the same, basically the same, same distribution of aid. But you're going to see that there are really two factors that contribute to the difference. The general pattern is that districts would be better off using the cost equity distribution if they have a higher poverty rate and or higher spending per pupil. I'm sorry, lower spending per pupil. And I think the main reason is that if you think about with the weighting that districts that are spending more per pupil are getting, say, a higher poverty rate. In this case, they get the average. So that would mean that their tax rate would be higher. They'd be worse off. The flip side is that lower spending towns, instead of getting the lower amount, the sort of the minimum amount for poverty, would be getting the average. So they'd be better off. And in the end, we're raising the same amount of money to go into the education fund. Are there questions on that?
I was mesmerized.
Yeah, I must have been memorized because I missed can you explain again the ES ADM column as well as the final rate column?
Okay. Right. So the ESADM is education spending, which is actually coming from where it says remaining education spending, and it's divided by the column ADM. All right, so it's equivalent of what we now do, which is education spending per equalized pupil. But in this case, we're not equalizing the pupils. We're just we're using ADM.
Right. Okay.
Okay, and then that's the amount that's divided by the yield in order to get your rate.
Okay.
Same as we do in current law. But because even though, so if you looked in that column, spending ES per ADM, you can see that the spending per pupil is now around $10,000 when it used to be $16,000. And that's just because we backed out all of that cost equity aid. But in order to get enough money into the ed fund to cover all this, we had to lower the yield. So you end up with rates that are in the same range as where they are currently.
In the WTD?
It's weighted, the weighted rate. Sorry, it's the one that maybe it was called proposed this morning.
So that's the modeled rate or the proposed
Yes.
rate that matches the rate on the model on the table that we looked at this morning with Brad. Those are identical columns.
That weighted column should be the same as Brad's column J.
I hope so.
The only way it wouldn't be is if it's a typo.
Okay.
Yeah. Senator Perchlik, are you done?
Yes, thank you.
Representative Beck.
Hey, Deb, the property yield and the income yield, do you have those numbers at your fingertips?
No.
Okay. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I have
I can
to
kinda
admit,
guess.
when we ran through all these processes, we didn't also run all the tables for the income yield.
Okay,
It's just the property.
So they're supposed
okay,
to be,
I can see what, okay,
they're supposed to be set proportionally. So where the property yield makes you go up or down, the income yield would also go up or down.
okay, I'm just curious, because I know that, just looking at this, looks like the income yield is around 46.29 or something like that. I just, or the property yield, I'm sorry, is 46.29, I think. But, okay, I'm just curious what the numbers would look like.
That's in the ballpark, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Just for clarity's sake, correct me if I'm wrong, the last two columns in this chart, there's no function to get from one to the other. It's really there for comparison's sake. Is that,
Yes.
would that be a correct say?
Yes, absolutely. The last three columns are just for comparison. And hopefully all of the numbers match Brad's so that you could find the same district on his sheets.
And again, we're using ADM, not equalized pupils, because we don't need to
Right.
equalize the pupils anymore in this scenario.
That question.
So all that-
I have to get answered.
Extra math that Brad is so good at disappears, but he'll still be useful.
Our job.
Yes. Representative James.
Yeah, Deb, could you just summarize again in general? You had earlier you had sort of summarized the districts that will do better under the cost equity model are this, and the districts that will not fare as well are that. Could you run that by us one more time?
Okay, I think that the main difference here is that, well, as you know, these things are sort of interrelated, but if you look at the spending per pupil column, the ES per ADM, the ones where the spending per pupil is greater than 10,000 will do worse under this method than under the weighted method. And that is mainly because their spending is higher than average. So under the weighted method, they would get a higher than average amount per each in each category. Under the cost equity method, they're going to get the average, so they won't get as much out of the ed fund. So they have to raise their rate to get the same amount. The districts where they're spending less than 10,000, and actually the break isn't exactly at 10,000, but the districts are spending less than that, will do better getting the average amount than getting the amount based on their lower spending.
Thanks.
And the districts with just very high poverty counts will also do better under the cost equity formula.
And Deb, can you help me understand sort of the magnitude of the tax rate changes on the cost equity formula versus the magnitude of the cost rate changes under the weighted rate? I'm trying to like, is there a range? I'm sorry, I haven't asked you this question before, and I'm trying to sort of do it in my head as I look down. Is there a range of the rate changes that you see in one model that's different from the range of rate changes that you see in the other model?
Oh, you mean compared to current law?
Or compared to current law and compared between cost equity and the weighted model? Yes, both compared to current law. Each one compared to current law.
I guess
Kathleen
it would,
understands my question, I think, so maybe she can explain it.
No, but I
Yeah.
understand it. You're on your own.
The range in this is higher. So I guess if we're comparing the difference in rate between current law and the cost equity formula, what does the range of those changes look like compared to the range of changes when we compare the weighted model to current law?
I don't know offhand.
Okay,
My guess is that if the range might be greater from current law with the cost equity formula, only because it is giving more benefit to low spending districts.
okay.
And therefore it's going to make high spending districts go up more.
And then there are some places that just have blanks.
They don't have any kids.
Yeah, like,
Which is Somerset, I think, actually. And I know what happens in Somerset, so that's fine. Sorry.
Good.
Okay. Yes. Other questions? Yeah.
Just. Yeah, I don't want to interrupt Deb. Deb, could you just talk a little bit about non-operating districts? And kind of how things are applied. I know if I sat here and thought about it, I could figure it out, but it might be quicker if you just say it.
non-operating meaning tuition.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I have a problem with what we're doing with tuitioning, and but I don't have the answer. But I'll try to explain it this way: that what we're doing now with poverty is we're assigning it to the district. However, either it doesn't matter which one we're
To the
looking
town.
at, weighting or this. We're sort of assigning that poverty money to the school that's educating the kid. And I think that's right, because they're the ones that need the money. But at the same time, we're depriving the tuitioning town of the ability to pay for that tuition. And in the case of let's just say a unified district, and it has 6 towns in it, but the students are all being lumped together. They're all considered together. So the weights all go into that one unified district, and everybody's tax rate is exactly the same because it's calculated based on the overall spending per pupil in that unified district. But with a tuition town, they go to a school, and the cost in that school, and we're going to send the poverty money there so that the spending per pupil actually reflects the district where the kids are educated. But the district has one tax rate based on their spending per pupil in that district, and the tuitioning town doesn't have that same ability to meet that tuition cost because we haven't weighted their ability. So if you look, for example, at, I think it's town 57, Granville Hancock.
That happened to be the one I was looking
District
at.
57 on Brad's sheet or wherever. You can see basically, oops, I don't have this in front of me. But I think that you can see that their spending per pupil jumps way up, even though they're sending their kid to a district where the tuition isn't that high. And so I think somehow we need to do the same thing that we do for tuitioning districts, and that is make their tax rate be the same as that of the district to which they tuition, and then make the tuition cost as close as possible to the spending per pupil. Would be the fairest way to deal with them.
It would require a somewhat more complex formula if the tuition
Yeah.
town sent their kids a whole bunch of districts.
Yeah, which is why there's no model of it at
Yeah.
all. And Deb, so when you said now, I think you didn't mean current law, you meant in the model that Brad introduced this morning, right?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes,
Okay, it's
sorry.
okay.
Thank you.
No,
Yes.
it's totally confusing. And then in the cost equity model, what are you doing about tuitioning?
I did exactly the same thing.
Okay,
But I think it's a question that we haven't talked through enough. And I think that right now, I just think we need to make a decision about it, but I think it's not fair the way it is. And in terms of a more complicated, it would be more complicated in formula, but also, I mean, it wouldn't be that difficult in terms of if you had a district tuitioning all their kids to another district, in which case we could just say that the tax rate created by the spending per pupil in the host district applies to the tuitioning district as well.
Representative Beck?
I want to make sure, because I think there's some, people are using the word tuitioning and non-operating synonymously. Are we talking about non-operating districts or are we talking about all districts that tuition? There's a difference.
She can't see that you're looking at her, so she doesn't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are we talking about districts that tuition, non-operating districts that tuition all of their kids? Or are we talking about all districts that tuition some of their kids or both?
In the example we just discussed, it was strictly a non-operating.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because
Yeah.
people are using those words synonymously here.
Yeah.
Okay,
It gets more complex.
okay,
Operating cases.
Right.
okay.
I want to, so Brad, are you in agreement that we're only talking about non-operating districts, not just any tuitioning students?
No, you know, it comes up here. I think, I don't know where the microphones are in this room. I think when we're talking about the FRL counts, it's really apparent when we're talking about a non-operating district that does not operate a school K through 12. Okay, their kids are tuitioned elsewhere. But if you think of a situation like Georgia, the school district of Georgia, they operate K6, pre-K6, and I think it's, and then the tuition 712, or maybe they tuition 912, but they're tuitioning a lot of their secondary kids. And so the FRL count for those kids, which is kind of where we're looking at Deb's referencing here, is showing up in the modeling that I think both Deb and I just did at the school district where the kids are going to school.
Yeah, that's how.
No, going to school.
Not where they're
Going to school.
So it's all tuitioning students that are being shifted this way, not just non-operating
Not just
districts.
non-operated. It's clear in the non, but to your point, you are correct. There is a difference between non-operating and tuition. And they are being used because you can operate and tuition, or you can tuition everybody or operate for everybody.
Right.
So that's the difference.
So that's my question. I'm still not clear here. So is this model only, sending the weights to the school where the kid's being educated for non-operating districts or for tuition districts?
In my case, and what I did is it was for the tuition district. So using Georgia as the example again,
Okay,
the secondary students who live in Georgia, their weight for poverty is not in
Georgia, it's in some other,
school district
School
because they're tuition somewhere else. And I think, if I'm
Okay.
speaking for you now, Deb, and you can correct me, I'm looking at your picture down here. I think that's the case for what Deb did also.
okay,
Yes.
so what if the example of Georgia, what if some of those kids are going to an approved independent school?
Then again, the way I broke out FRL, the FRL is those kids going to St. Johnsbury, would be a long way.
Okay, yeah, they did.
Yeah, St. Johnsbury
So they did.
would come back to Georgia
Those weights would go back to Georgia.
That's right. Those weights would go back to Georgia. Okay, the ones going to a public school, South Burlington, Burlington, Champlain.
That would go to South Burlington School
That's
District.
right, that's right.
And that's all in here.
That's all in here.
Okay.
And that's in yours as well, Deb.
Yes,
Yeah,
Okay,
because
great.
that ran her FRL numbers off what I had.
Okay.
So I'll make a comment. I mean, mathematically, this all works out the same because the tuitions that the districts or independent schools are going to charge are going to reflect all of this. So mathematically, we're not doing anything here, but I think what we're doing is confusing the whole subject, not to mention the distortion that's going to occur in the approved independent tuition that comes from what public schools are charging. And remember, those ones are getting the weights. And then the independent schools are tied to that and they're not getting the weights. I mean, boy, I mean, mathematically, money-wise, you're doing nothing. Nothing's happening here. But to do all of this to make nothing happen just seems like, wow.
I also think that it's going to create a greater magnitude of transition challenges if we do implement it. For instance, the example from Granville Hancock, which frankly I have no idea where that is.
On your side.
They, you know, if this happened in the short term, they just wouldn't have the money on hand without a massive tax rate change to pay the tuition costs for students.
Well, they go to those schools, assuming they go to the schools and they say, our tuition bill just went like this.
Mhm.
That's what they'll do. I mean, they'll say, you got the weights. We're not paying $15,000 a year anymore. We're paying $8,000. That's what'll happen. And that'll show up in the average announced tuition.
Senator Hardy, you had?
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say that this is just an example of why the whole tuition, even current law tuition and proposed changes in tuition are so, the way that we do tuition doesn't make sense. And because it doesn't actually track with the cost of educating the students. And that's what, we need to have a better way of setting tuition. And this is just showing that with such a big increase, why it's problematic.
I completely agree with that statement. I mean, public tuitions, and we've had testimony to that, they don't necessarily reflect what the actual cost of education.
Right, so I think we are doing something with the math there, Scott, because, or Representative Beck, because there's not a necessary reflection right now with tuition rates. And so I'm not saying this is better. I mean, I agree, it confuses the matter, but it also is not currently reflective.
Representative Beck, do you have any more to
Nope.
add before I go to?
So again, I'm doing a little bit habit of thinking out loud. So taking the whole independent school situation aside, it's a little bit easier to look to understand using a cost equity payment, because that's actually, you can directly track the money that's going to the district to educate those students. So you could adjust the tuition to balance that dollar for dollar.
In the public schools,
In the
that's
public-
exactly what would happen.
Well,
Yeah.
one would think, but
I mean, this would be nothing for the independent schools because the weight to an independent school doesn't come to the independent school right now. It stays with the district. Where they get tied up in is that now you're going to have this, you know, this average announced tuition is not going to even be right close to what, and they're tied, and some of them are tied to that. That's the.
Deb, do you have more you want to show us on this, or should we continue our conversation?
Yeah, I think I'll just be able to answer questions at this point. I didn't want to pull you through anything else.
Thank you. I think what you said, Representative Conlon, about how it brings so much more clarity to where the money is going and how much money we're talking about, has a lot going for it. it really lowers the confusion factor significantly. This whole tuition and conversation aside, I'm
Yeah.
moving away from that conversation. But the magnitude of the changes, I think, is higher in this. And so the transitions also become that much more important. Thoughts? Yeah.
It wouldn't solve the confusion, but if you wanted to solve the problem, you could just do away with average announced tuition.
You will be.
I wasn't talking about tuitioning at all anymore,
Oh.
but I can if you want to
I
talk
thought
about
you
that.
Emily?
Yeah,
I think what would be helpful on the cost equity payment, the system would be to show it as the steps compared to the current system. So we've seen those charts, or Senator Brock, how do we get it on one page, which is difficult, but we have all the different steps. This would be much easier to put on one page. And it would, I think it would be, if this is more than just a exercise of looking at the numbers, it would be good to see it, how the steps would happen, how you get to these numbers as compared to the current formula.
mhm.
Because we haven't talked about that.
Yeah, Representative Odie, who is not here today, is in House Ways and Means. She really likes to keep on coming back to the principles of a good tax system. And like, I think she mentioned simplicity, like every other meeting that we have, and I'm thinking of her as you say that. Are there other questions that are coming up for folks about the differences between these two approaches to solving the problem of equity? Shall we talk about tuitioning then? Further?
We can,
What?
sure.
Go for it.
Oh, I mean, I guess I would just say, I mean, that you're, right now with tuitioning, all the weights stay with the district that is responsible for the kid. There's no, well, I mean, it's hard to, I don't know how you would push weights to an independent school. If you go to a system where if you send them to a public school, the weights go with the kid. If you send them to an independent school, the weights stay with the district. I mean, like I said, mathematically it all, but boy, it really potentially confuses the whole subject. I mean, you would be in a situation where you would be like, okay, we're sending some kids to, Danville High School, and we're paying $10,000 tuition. We're sending, these kids to Linden Institute, and we're paying them $17,500. And people are going to look at that and they're going to go, well, you're not going to, I mean, if you say, oh, but the weights go to Danville School District, they're not going to be able to figure that out.
So as far as it affects the tuition bill, the bill would consist of the amount that sending district is paying, plus the weighted amount that the receiving district is getting, and simply communicating that at least accomplishes letting people understand what's happening. And because the tuition rate is actually higher because of that move of the weight.
I mean, it could be explained.
We have a lot to explain.
I'm not sure if anybody could understand it.
That only applied to the public school, so.
Yes, it would have public schools only.
Then you'd have to explain what was happening with the private school.
But the private school, though, they have the weight at the sending district to begin with. They got the weight, so I'm assuming that wouldn't change.
No, that's the same as they do it now.
The private
Wait for-
school has the cost, right, of the student. So would
Yes.
they have to raise the tuition in order to accommodate the cost so that the money would come from the
I don't know
weights
if
and
the
descending
tuition would
school?
be any different in a private school arrangement in the future than it is today. I mean, aside from, because we aren't doing a whole lot, well, we're doing a little bit different in terms of adding the weights that weren't there before. But the receiving private school would be getting presumably after negotiation, would have the ability to get those rates or something similar to them.
Representative Conlon.
Using the cost equity payment method, where you could literally track the difference dollar per student. And you could, I guess in the case of an independent school, you could charge what you needed to charge for tuition. That dollar for dollar match would go to the town as sort of a offset.
Sure.
And that could work, but then you are literally having to bill by exactly who the student is and what their weight, what their factors are.
Yeah.
Which could be kind of a nightmare too.
I think there are some questions for that about if this is something that goes through town meeting, what are the privacy concerns and protections for those individual students and their individual
challenging.
status, especially in a small town. I have a question maybe for Jim. On a sort of legal moral level, if the responsibility, which I know are not the same thing. I'm very aware that legal and moral are not the same thing. I was not trying to imply that they are. I'm just, if the responsibility for educating the students sits with the state, right? And the state devolves that responsibility to the district. And the district remains in law, the one responsible for educating the students that are within the district, regardless of where that district goes to school. So we know that in special ed law, the district remains responsible for the education of that kid, even if that kid leaves the state to be educated. Does that mean on some level that the weights need to stay where sort of the legal, like locus of responsibility is? And I don't know if, Jim, you want to come up and like think that through with us, or if that's just something you want to think about later. Sorry, I just bring that one on you.
No problem. For the record, Jim Rivers, Council. So I'm not going to actually restate the question.
Yeah. So we know that the primary, like the responsibility for educating students sits with the state. That's sort of the point of Brigham, right? And then we devolve that responsibility to the school districts. And in special ed law, we know that that responsibility stays with the school districts no matter where the student goes, right? It's still the school district's responsibility to provide that education to the students. So in the case of tuitioning, whether it's to a private school, to an independent school, or to another public school, do the weights sort of represent in the law the legal locus of responsibility? And so in that case, do they need to stay with the district who's ultimately responsible for that student?
Well, let me point distinction first. The responsibility for special education students comes from federal law.
Mhm.
And the responsibility for educating students in Vermont, from equity standpoint, comes to the Vermont Constitution at different sources there. And the weights are only a tool, right, to get to equity. Whether you get to equity through the weights or through federal aid, policy choice. That answers your question, but these are tools to use to get to a state mandate of ensuring substantial equity and educating students. And the only tools.
And I think, sorry, just right.
Yeah, please.
One thing that I think a lot about in the context of federal law has devolved a lot of responsibility to the states, and then we devolve responsibility to the towns, but the funding to go with that is rarely also devolved down to the levels. And it's one of the reasons that I think we're in some of the situations we're in, and, states struggle financially. And so I try when I'm thinking about policy to make sure that the locus of financial control sits where the locus of legal control is, because I think that's one of the fairer ways to do it. It's not always possible. It's just sort of a factor that I want to bring into this. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask the same question, but in a different way. Could it be open to a legal challenge by an LEA? Let's say it's a non-operating LEA. If we send the weights or the cost equity payment to the district in which the kids are being educated, because it remains the responsibility, as Representative Kornheiser said, of the LEA to educate these kids. Could an LEA say, if it's our responsibility, then we should be handling the funding part of that?
I think so, because it's a state responsibility in the end. All these LEAs and all these districts are entities of the state. So it's sort of at the state level. And when you look at Brigham, it's about substantial equality of educational opportunity for students. We're talking about the issue of tax rate. We have less taxing capacity at the tuition towns, right? Which could be unfair to those towns from a tax perspective. But Brigham didn't address that issue. So it's not a Brigham issue to have tax inequity. It's a Brigham issue to have tax inequity that leads to an equal educational opportunity. So as long as you have substantial equality of educational opportunity for students, the tax question is kind of a separate question. Could be challenged under tax laws, maybe, but I can't speak about tax law challenges because I'm not an expert in that.
And I have a separate question on tax equity, and I don't know if it's a question for Jim or if Jim wants to go into that, but people are saying that that's part of what we should be thinking about, but I'm not sure I even understand what they mean by tax equity. And you just brought it up, so I didn't know if you had a definition of what would be tax inequity.
I think Abby's on the,
But we're talking about it later.
is Abby on the Zoom? Abby, are you paying any attention to us? I'm sorry to ask you that publicly.
Oh, she must have been, yeah.
Sorry.
She is.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry. I have been listening. So
I'm
for the
so
record,
sorry.
no problem. There's a bit of, I'll try and stay out of this on there. So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. As Jim was just saying, the decision in Brigham does not address tax equity. So I think your question, it doesn't require any particular form of financing for the education system for ensuring substantial equality of education. So I don't know if that fully answers your question.
No, I understand that part is clear, but the question is, what is tax equity? How would you define it? I mean, I understand education equity about equal opportunity, but when people say tax equity, I'm not sure what they mean. Do they mean kind of like what we talked with Deb Brighton before about you're paying the same percentage of your income? Is that tax equity, or is that just tax equalization that everybody's paying the same percent? Or is it some other, like a progressive tax structure where it's more equitable because the less you make, you pay, a lower percentage? Is there a working definition of tax equity, or is it just a term that people use individually?
So it's more of a principle. It does not have a statutory definition. It's definitely brought up in case law. And I'm looking at my giant volumes of Hellerstein. I could look through there and try and cite something for you. But I think what you're referencing is progressivity. So that's a principle and a value that Brigham, I believe, alludes to as a, it's not necessarily a requirement though. And within, it's not the Commerce Clause, but it's due process does require some form of equity, but there isn't any one definition. There isn't a legal requirement.
Senator Perchlik, in my very limited experience talking about taxes, I have found that people use the phrase tax equity to mean exactly what they want it to mean in the moment they're talking about it. And sometimes that means progressive, meaning people are paying according to their capacity. And sometimes it means that everyone is paying the same amount.
And could it, and maybe there, I think there's even other definite.
Any other, and those were just two that I threw out right there that are very different from each other. Deb, did you want to add anything to that conversation?
No,
No, okay.
I agree that the definition really is used by people differently in every conversation.
So back to tuition.
Yeah.
Although I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Abby.
I think, there seems to be a desire by some to have the weighting follow the kid, which I think is, if we were gonna go to the cost equity formula, I think that's what Deb's calling it. It would be very easy to have those dollars follow kids, whether they're going to an independent or an approved or a public. That's easy to follow them. That's easy to follow. But to have it go to one or not the other, like I said, it all works out in the end, but it would be so. But yeah, you could do the money follow the kid, and then the publics and the approves, just they adjust their tuition from there. That's definitely possible.
James?
But I think if I'm understanding this correctly, it would be really critical that they adjust their tuition accordingly, right?
Of
Because
course, yeah.
like vital, because when I think about non-operating districts, I think about them sort of being at the mercy of, whatever the tuition is, they have to pay it, right? Like they have no way to adjust their costs or cut their spending or do anything but pay the bill that's offered to them. So unless we fix the tuitioning part, then the non-operating districts are going to be, I'm just looking at some of the non-operating districts I know on here, and the cost equity formula does seem to have a more onerous impact on them.
My experience, maybe it's different from your, but my experience is when districts they're in a tuition, they don't feel like they have control of their tuition. It's not that they don't have control of the tuition rate. That's a conversation that happens between schools. What they don't necessarily have control over is how many tuitions they're going to have to pay.
Yes.
Okay, none of this solves any of that. That's good management at the school district level to pay on the years when you have a surplus, you hold on to it for the years that you guessed the wrong way.
So I guess two things I'm curious, yes. So the amount that, I guess I would be curious to learn a little bit more, and Scott, you and I could just talk at lunch about the amount of bargaining or conversation that goes on about that enhanced tuition rate, whether it is a back and forth, a lot. That's slightly reassuring. But the second is, that number of students who moves in, and I think we all remember what happened to Winhall this year, or at least I do, when Winhall became sort of a locus for COVID migrants, for lack of a better word. And they had, 50 new students at a cost of, 20,000 per kid or something. And it was a huge budget hit for them, and they had very little control over that.
And I just said, it's a huge budget boom for them in a year or two, especially if those kids leave.
Yeah. I have a question for Deb that's not about tuition. So I don't know what you would prefer.
I think it would be helpful for us to go back to the cost equity formula more broadly. And then we can before we do that, what do people want to know to be making a decision about where the tuitioning dollars sit in the model? Are there things that people need to know before we make a decision about that? Yes.
I would say couple of things. One is to run the model if it's not too challenging, as if the weight or the cost equity grant stays with the district.
So that you can see the
Yeah,
difference?
so I can see the difference. And two, somebody with a little more expertise than we might have, think about the idea if you're using a cost equity formula and the money goes with the with the kid, as you were pointing out, how do we get around really having to get to the nitty gritty of identifying what a kid's weights are for each individual student?
Thanks. Are you on tuition? Okay, great.
Yeah. So, and then I do have questions for Deb on the other things, but I mean, I may be the only one on the committee who feels this way. I don't think I am, though. I have just a lot of discomfort with public money going to private schools. And I think that I know that some of our education committee conversations are happening around this specifically because of recent court cases involving religious schools. But just in general, if we were to go to some kind of cost equity formula, having that payment go directly to a private school, I just have a discomfort with. And I know that this is a system we've had for years in Vermont. I'm well aware of that. I feel like we send too much public school money to private schools, and I don't think we should. And I would prefer that our districts that either stay part of a district and are in a district, or if they are a tuition district, that they only tuition to public schools. I know that there are parts of the state, your two parts of the state, that have traditional academies or whatever they're called, and those could probably be an exception given the structure of those. But I just wanted to express my discomfort with public money going to private schools, generally speaking. So, and I don't know if that adds to what the information we need, but it does add to sort of when I think about it, how it makes me feel. Thanks.
So that being said, would you allow the money to stay with the district and be balanced with tuition coming from, being asked by the private schools? Or are you saying that, with the exception of the schools that we already have these relationships with, that there wouldn't be any tuition going to private schools?
I think ideally, we would not be sending public money to private schools. And the one exception that, I think could to that would be the private academies that are
Already.
are in places where there literally aren't other schools. But I'm just uncomfortable with sending public money to private schools. They are outside of, it's public dollars. They're outside of the public oversight, and especially when we're getting into conversations, the potential of religious schools, that makes me even more uncomfortable. And I know that our education committees are discussing, or I hope they are. And so I think that's going to be part of this broader conversation of oversight of private schools and how much we can do and what we can say. And I think that plays into how I would like to see tuition done or not.
So that said, I think with the limited weeks we have left on this, so this, like, in the grand scheme of the model we have, this was one, on some level, one small modeling decision, right? Like where the tuitioning dollars go in the model. And it could become an entire own task force in and of itself about what it means to right? Which is one of the magical natures of this task force in the summer and the time we spent together. And so I think given that feel like the decision on whether or not we should be tuitioning at all seems to be something that can sit squarely in the education committee and not here, where we definitely don't have time to unpack it. That it seems to make sense to me to leave the weights at the district that is sending, so that we don't have to make those decisions about where they go when they leave. To just continue to not make that decision at all, because making the decision halfway seems hard. And just like outside of our time frame that we have left. But are there other pieces of information that people would want before we can?
Can I just check
Yeah.
with Brad on that?
Yeah.
Is that reversing what you did in your model?
Yes.
Difficult? Because
Oh, is it difficult?
remember, it would be reversing what you did, but I can't remember. There was a reason that it was easier to do the way you did it, and I can't remember.
It would, I'm trying to remember what I left in the background in the model. Let me just go cut to the chase. In terms of the data that I have FRL counts at the schools they attend,
Yes,
including approved independent schools.
I remember.
that's
now.
what.
And then
Okay, yep.
I have the approved independent schools, the district of residence with that, which is what we're seeing right now.
Yep.
I also have the data by district of residence. And there's, you can't pull the two together, but I have the data by district of residence. So that I have FRL counts at the districts, which we initially started using a long time ago.
But wasn't there a difference in that data? Like it's not as accurate because of just collecting it?
The difference was, as I recall it, and I can talk to our data people who have the data, do the data collections. The difference had to do with what I was seeing for independent schools, because the first run of data was district. I'm not sure where independent schools were fitting into that, whether they were showing up or not. And that's something I need to check with them. That if they're giving it to me one way, then it's in the system somewhere, and it's a question of me getting the right words to them to pull it out.
Okay.
Is what I would need to see.
And this is why I remembered this being a modeling decision and not a policy decision. And so I am glad to have that a little bit confirmed, a confused memory. Okay. We will figure that out.
Yeah.
Okay. We have 11 minutes left before lunch. Of course, we can go over into our lunch period if that is our wish. The cost equity formula. Do people have other questions about that? Yeah, Senator Hardy.
So Deb, you may have said this, but your column that's called remaining education spending, is that education spending the way we define it now? Or, so for example, what do you do with special education grants, federal aid, et cetera? What is in that column?
It's what we now consider education spending. So
it
there's
does not
net of
include
the current special education grant, which I think is another issue that we're sort of ignoring at this point.
Yeah.
That
Yes.
then we're going to go to a census grant. So this won't be accurate, but
Exactly. So that's a big problem with this, the way that it's done, because that in the cost equity formula, it has even a bigger impact what we do with special ed.
no, it's exactly the same.
Well,
other words,
if you're looking at,
Go ahead, Deb.
I used exactly the same education spending that we used to start out Brad's model. We agree on that education spending. So that has netted out of it the current special ed money.
Brad.
Just one quick statement. What if you were to add Deb's first two columns? Okay, so the EL grant plus cost equity grant plus remaining education spending. That would be what I have on what I hand out in column D, the FY20 education spending.
okay,
So to answer your question, it is education spending as we currently define it, and then Deb broke it out further.
got it. Okay.
So it doesn't include transportation or special ed or any of those other
Right.
things.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. And then
Tuition income.
your ADM number, what did you end up doing with pre-K? How did you account for that in the ADM?
I did it the same way we do it now, which is giving them a negative 0.54, but I didn't show it as an added weight in the added weight tables. So it's actually a hidden negative weight, same as not current law, same as the way that Brad ran it.
Okay.
And to answer an earlier question that you had about the range, I just looked at the range in the rates, and both, let's see, the range is tighter for current law and the standard deviation is lower than both of the two things that you're looking at. The weighted rate range goes from a high of 2.83 to a low of 1.06. And the cost equity rate would go from a high of 2.5 to a low of 1.01. And I took out of that all of the districts that were at 1.
I think that's actually different than my question was, but it's also helpful. My question was about more the difference in magnitude of impact under the two different scenarios. So if is the, I'm going to keep on working on how to phrase it and asking.
Okay.
Okay. Ruth, did you have another question? I think Representative Beck does. It's okay. Representative Beck, I thought you had a question.
I don't, no.
It's gone. Okay. Anyone else have any? Yes.
Just an arithmetic question. And it's ELL plus cost equity payment plus the remaining education spending should equal what's in column D on the other spreadsheet. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because it doesn't.
No, because that's got ELL.
Yeah, the EL.
If the ELL that makes the difference?
That's
Yeah,
plus
okay,
added.
got it. That's it. Okay.
Yes, yeah, EL.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a very basic question that I'm just not pulling it on. Under current law, a special education student is given all of the weights. And under the calculations that have been done here, we're talking about controlling and not controlling. If it's a special education student who's also from poverty and is ELL, those weights still apply to that student.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Sure. Yep.
It's that,
yeah, this goes back to thinking about tuition, because we also tuition some of those students away, but I'm not going to go there right now.
the difference
just thinking
between,
in my head.
yes, the difference between with controls and without controls for special ed, is that what you're asking for clarification?
No,
on?
I'm fine.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Because it's a beast, that one. What do people think of this, of the cost equity model? Pros, cons? Yes.
I like it. And the biggest reason why I like it is it gets at the weighting equity problem that exists where your higher spending districts are getting more than that's a huge equity issue for me. And this solves that issue. And it also, I think it's way more explainable to voters than equalized pupils.
Yeah.
Agreed. The reality on the ground, however, the extremes are pretty rough.
Meaning that the transition would be even harder than the transition under the weighted model. that what you
Yes, well, and I'm not even sure you could make a full transition without really
Yeah.
affecting some districts negatively.
And that is because you're taking away that inequity.
No, I philosophically, I agree with everything you're saying.
Yeah.
On the ground reality is a different matter.
So that's one con. Other things that feel challenging or look challenging about the cost equity formula?
It'd be good to know if that's the case throughout all, like Deb gave us the range of the high and low. So with the equity formula, the range is less. But I know I'd looked through some too, and it is different. Like the change is very great on some, greater with the cost equity than with the new model weights. But it would be good to know on balance how much of a change it is. I don't think Deb's chart had the same totals. I don't know if that would even answer my question, but I guess that would be something that I'd want to think more about.
Total.
There's total impact.
Mhm.
Like
Yes.
I hear what Representative Conlon, and when I looked through it, that rings true, but I don't know if it's true because you can't total them all up and see which one has a greater deviation from what we're doing today.
James.
Yeah, I see the upsides as well. I guess the only thing I'm thinking about is how this would work out for district budgeting, like when folks would know their amount. And also just some of the feedback we've heard, some of the perceived concerns about categorical aid and how that's, subject to tinkering by the legislature. And I guess I would want to make sure that we're setting in place a system that isn't going to bring us back here every January to say, hey, let's talk about that cost equity payment amount. And, maybe we need to adjust that a little bit this year. And so that would be a real concern of mine.
So I think there would naturally be an inflator built in. I think it's important that right now, as we're talking about this, and as Deb designed it, it is not a grant. It is just like blanket payment to districts based on the students they have. And so if districts know who their students are, they know what their payment would be. It wouldn't be subject to appropriations or anything like that. But agreed.
And just like the weights, just as Dr. Colby has recommended with the weights, we would then need to recalculate those amounts every couple of years, not here in the legislature, but at JFO or AOE or whoever does that to make sure that the costs are still accurate.
And in future foreshadowing for the committee, we have an agenda item coming up about not just transition mechanisms for all the districts, but transition mechanisms on a regular basis. So for how we recalibrate and communicate about this stuff, so we never have to have this task force ever again. Yes.
Just to add on to what
Oh,
Kathleen said about, how do we make sure that this doesn't get, tinkered with down the road or whatever. There's two things that are built in the system, I think, that are strongly help to prevent that. One is the tax letter. Those numbers come out. Districts are counting on them. They budget based on them. We're not coming back in February, March and tinkering. Been here long enough to know that's not going to happen. The other thing is that which is very unique, we operate in a self-balancing fund. And if we ever made a decision to come in here and say, we're going to cut these amounts, and guess what we just did? We just put it on the property tax rate. And I don't think that's a decision that this body is going to take very lightly to do something like that.
That's a good point.
Kind of hard.
Deb, you used, when you did these calculations, you used I'm kind of trying to get back to your table. Which amount did you use? Did you use the average?
Global average.
The average cost per, getting back to the first table, the global
Yeah,
average versus the actual average, I use the global one.
You used the global average. Okay.
Yes.
So I guess I think it's important to make sure that's the right number, first of all, and that's the right amount that we would assign to each thing. I actually don't think an inflator on it makes sense because there are shifts in those costs to relative to each other and relative to, the cost for for example, sparsity doesn't necessarily go up by the rate of inflation every year. So I don't think I mean, if we are going to put some kind of automatic inflator on it, I'm not sure that that's the right one. I would really have to get some more testimony on whether or not an inflator makes sense. And I also am more curious, and Deb, you might have thought about this, but how this impacts overall total education spending. Because we had talked about that in the concept of the weights, that some of the districts that would lose tax capacity may not cut their budgets as much as the capacity they lose. So, and vice versa. So overall spending may actually increase with the implementation of the weights. And I haven't thought about this enough because you kind of surprised us with these numbers, but how it would impact the total education spending and what that interaction might be.
Right. I think there's no way for us to answer that question, really. I think in either case, we would expect that the lower spending districts who suddenly have this excess capacity would probably spend more. And I think that in either case, we probably feel that the higher spending districts will have a harder time coming down than the lower districts would have going up.
But in the difference between the weights versus the cost equity payment, like how would that play out?
Well,
That's what
if
I'm
that
trying
were
to.
true, it benefits the lower spending districts more. So in other words, if that were true, that is more likely that the lower spending districts would come up and the higher spending districts go down. Then you would see more of that with the cost equity. But I don't know that that's true. It's just sort of what people have been discussing.
Emily, can I ask Ruth?
Yeah.
Ruth, when you asked that question about the averages, were you just asking which is when you said we should make sure it's the right number, did you mean just between the statewide average and global average? Or did you mean whether the dollar number was the right number? You know what I mean?
Whether the dollar number is the right number, you know, if you look at the chart, the cost per eligible pupil associated with weights,
Mhm.
middle school, the 3727, that's what Deb used for the middle school amount.
Yeah.
Is that the right amount? You know, because it's based on the average for the weight, but if it's a different concept, you know, is this in reality what the cost is, or is this just the cost that the interactive weights come up with? Because this is no longer interactive. So without the interaction, that the amounts might change. That's what I'm trying to get at. And also I think we never had this conversation, but what Deb was alluding to earlier with is this the right amount overall? Like that we want to put 40% of our education spending toward these different categories. I mean, is, you know, 5% the right amount to put toward extra money for middle school and et cetera, that whole balance of the overall spending too.
And I guess I agree with that. And just to clarify with Deb, was based on that $10,000 baseline cost, right, Deb?
Yes.
In that 10,000 or 10,000 and change number was calculated based on current spending, right?
Right. So the weighting model, let's see. Yes, it's based on using the weighting model weights and applying it to the 2020 spending. and pupils in each of the different categories.
I guess to me, the question is that, and what I thought maybe Ruth was getting at, maybe what it was, what Senator Hardy was saying was, is that the right number? Should we be using the average 2020 spending per pupil as the right number to be multiplying the weights by, or is there another number that's more accurate? Or
And
better?
Professor Colby's memo highlights the idea that they can, calculate, or someone else, it can be academically calculated what the cost equivalent is rather than the weight equivalent is. Deb backed into it so that we would have a starting point for this conversation that would reflect the magnitude that was calculated for the weights. But the recalculation to come to a different number would take longer,
Right,
and
I get
we're
that.
here now.
I was just wondering whether,
I think that we need to figure that out.
yeah, what is the baseline cost of a student? The question, I guess, we don't really know.
Because we're sort of mixing models.
All right.
We're sort of trying to layer a foundation model on top of a tax equity, tax equalization model. And I think that in some ways that solves some of the problems we were seeing. But it also begs the question of, should we be backing into foundation amounts from a tax equalization model? I don't know that that's an accurate way of doing it. And so I need to think about that more. And
Or is it less accurate than the way we're doing it now with?
who knows?
Complicated.
Yeah.
And it might be more equitable than we're doing it now, or that we would do it in this other way, but that doesn't mean it's the best possible option if we are opening up the whole box and messing with everything. I think with that, we're gonna eat lunch now,
Awesome.
and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Deb.